Hello and welcome everyone to the Abbe Museum's virtual program today, and thank you for joining us. We've had an incredible group of Indigenous scholars and leaders who have been presenting these past several months, and I would like to thank each and every one of them and also to each and every one of you for tuning into our series on Indigenous methodologies. It's been a very fulfilling experience to witness this incredible work that's being done. My name is Star. I'm the Curator of Education here at the Abbe Museum. As a museum dedicated to Wabanaki history, art, and culture, I'd first like to begin by recognizing the territory from which the museum is broadcasting today by reading our land acknowledgement. We are in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous peoples and ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all of the Native communities who have lived here for thousands of generations in what is now known today as Maine, New England, and the Canadian Maritimes. We make this acknowledgement aware of the continual violations of water, territorial rights, and sacred sites in the Wabanaki homeland. The Abbe is honored to collaborate with the Wabanaki as they share their stories. Today, I'm pleased to present our final program of the year in the Indigenous Methodology series titled What's Next? Indigenous Methods for Indigenous Futures. And I'd first like to start our program by introducing Dr. Sandy Grande, who is leading our panel tonight. Dr. Grande is a professor of social science in Native American and Indigenous studies at the University of Connecticut, with affiliations in the American Studies, philosophy, and the race, ethnic, and politics program. Her research and teaching interfaces Native American and Indigenous studies with critical theory toward the development of a more nuanced analysis of the colonial present. She recently was awarded the Ford Foundation Senior Fellowship for a project on Indigenous elders and aging. Her book, Red Pedagogy, Native American Social and Political Thought, was published in a 10th anniversary edition, and a Portuguese translation is anticipated to be published in Brazil in 2021. She's also a very prolific writer, having published numerous books, chapters in books and articles. She's also a founding member of the New York Stands with Standing Rock, a group of scholars and activists that forward the aim of the Native American and Indigenous sovereignty and resurgence. As one of their projects, they published the Standing Rock syllabus. And in addition to her academic and organizing work, she has provided elder care for her parents for over 10 years and remains the primary caregiver of her 92-year-old father. Dr. Grande, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I thank you for gathering these incredible Indigenous women to share their work and by sharing your platform with them. I'll be turning off my camera and mic at this time, and I'll be handing it over to you. But I do want to remind the audience that you are all more than welcome to submit questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to them following the panel. So thank you, Sandy, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Star. Ayanchu, Sweetie, Sandy Grande, coming to you from my dad's house. I'm in Hartford, Connecticut, which I believe is Wanguk territory historically. So just want to begin again by thanking you, Star, and all the folks at the Abbe Museum, which lately seems to be taking the museum world by storm. I knew Chris Newell before he was famous. But as soon as I was invited to be part of this series, I knew right away I wanted to share this space with Valerie Shirley and Janene Yazzie, because I think in this moment of, sort of naked, unvarnished white supremacy and all of its manifestations that we see in terms of climate change, the global pandemic, anti-Black violence, the ongoing threat of Indigenous genocide, I think a lot about Indigenous methodologies, which to me translates into, in some ways, still Linda Smith's sort of 25 Indigenous projects, where she articulates methods that are really actions. She talks about claiming, storytelling, intervening, returning, remembering, et cetera, et cetera. There's 25 of them. For those of you unfamiliar with her work, I would definitely check it out. Her book is Decolonizing Methodologies, which is an absolute classic. But I think together those projects define indigeneity as a real competing moral vision and way of being in the world. And so I think if there's one thing, especially any teachers joining us today, to take from this discussion, it's that the practice of Indigenous methodology, it's not about inclusion or equality or even equity for that matter. In other words, it's not about including Native peoples or offering Native peoples an equal piece of the American pie. It's understanding that the pie itself is rotten, that the pie only really exists through a logic of scarcity, meaning that only a certain number of people can eat, only a certain number of people are deserving enough to eat. And it's such a powerful myth. I mean, I think particularly in this week of the sort of settler story at Thanksgiving, it's really a trip to see how people are still willing to die and wage war to defend their right to this feast, even as it's contingent upon the exclusion of or even the killing of others. We haven't really ventured very far from that originary myth as a nation. Or I should say the settler nation hasn't really traveled very far since its originary myths. But these are the logics of capital and really settler colonialism. And so when I think of the antidote to these violences, I think of Indigenous methodologies. And when I think of Indigenous methodologies, I think of these two women who are with us today, who are doing this work every day in their communities and beyond. Valerie Shirley is a professor at the University of Arizona, who helped to found the Indigenous Teacher Education Project, and who have had a few opportunities to do some work with. I know that Valerie, you'll be sharing with us some information about the work that you do with Indigenous teachers. And Janene Yazzie is just I don't even know how to explain you, Janene, as an Indigenous woman activist, organizer, extraordinaire, fighter for particularly on multiple fronts, but I know your work more recently is sort of centered around climate justice. But originally had the fortune of having Janene in my classroom as a student, but Janene, you were never one of my, right away, I was just like, why don't you just like kind of co-teach this classes? Because I knew I had just as much to learn from you as I could have ever imagined teaching you. And so it's just been thrilling to watch all the work that you've done since that time. I don't even know how many years ago. It will age both of us if I did remember that number. And particularly, just how instrumental you were and continue to be in serving the Navajo Nation as one of the hardest hit communities in this global pandemic. So that's been inspiring as always. So we're all extraordinarily lucky to be in the presence of these women. So I'm going to start us off with a question, which is, how has this climate that I sort of, at least attempted to explain, impacted the communities you work with? And just we'll open up. Actually, Janene, why don't we start with you, and then Val, you can share after that.
All right, thank you. And thank you again for inviting me. Whenever Sandy invites me or reaches out to me for anything, the answer is automatically yes. Because I have so much, you're the one that introduced me to this path about Indigenous methodologies with your book, Red Pedagogy, and just your instructions. So I'm extremely indebted to you for helping open my eyes, encouraging me to return home and apply a lot of this learning in a way that has been very transformational for me in the work that I do with my family. But you laid out very well the context we find ourselves in. And so with the work that we've been doing at the community level around sustainable development, climate justice, renewable energy justice, basically everything, right? When you're Indigenous, you're born into the front lines of almost every battle that is being waged under systems of capitalism, of neocolonialism, of settler colonialism, and the legacies thereof. But what we've seen here is really the convergence of all of these things, and the timeline of the pandemic and how it hit our community here on the Navajo Nation, our communities across the Navajo Nation, really showed the endemic legacy of all of these issues and the systemic challenges that we continue to face, from, you know, the emergence of us as a hotspot due to the lack of critical community infrastructure, which has a strong settler colonial history, and a very racist history around how public funds are used in and around reservation lands when it comes to building critical community infrastructure and ensuring access to clean drinking water, ensuring access to electricity, ensuring access to grocery stores and schools and gas stations. So we knew when we heard about this pandemic that our communities were already particularly vulnerable, not only because of those shortcomings, but because of the issues that we were already dealing with in terms of the systemic legacy of environmental contamination and pollution that already created public health issues that our communities were grappling with. So everything from the asthma to the rare cancers to the cardiovascular diseases, and to diabetes, like all of these things that were already being shown in the studies emerging from Europe to really highlight the particular vulnerabilities of certain demographics to extreme forms of COVID, we knew we're already going to be grappling with if this virus came to our homelands, along with the infrastructure issues. And so that, on top of having a white supremacist in office, I mean, it's not like it's any different from most administrations, right? From having a blatant white supremacist in office, meant that not only were we challenged with having to respond to the issues created by the pandemic and the overstress on our very limited healthcare systems, on our very limited food systems, but also having to deal and compete with like the continued threat to our lands, territories, and resources under an administration that was already targeted and reduced the Bears Ears National Monument as soon as he got into office, already approved the Dakota Pipeline, and that was really a huge supporter of the KXL. But was also very much supporting a lot of the uranium mining permits that were being discussed, as well as the Holtec proposal, which is a proposal to turn a section of New Mexico into a nuclear waste repository that would require highly contaminated nuclear waste from all parts of the country to travel through our homelands to get to this repository. So it was extremely overwhelming. In order to, and we're used to juggling these balls, but to deal with all of these things at the same time, I think really highlighted how inadequate the systems of justice are in responding to, in a timely manner, the urgent situation that we find ourselves in as Indigenous communities. But it also very beautifully, despite all of the loss and the grief that we're still trying to process from the way this virus has impacted our communities, it has also sparked a new level of hope and a new level of certainty in the ability of our Indigenous lifeways, our Indigenous approaches to community solutions can inform the building of holistic, robust responses despite these vulnerabilities. And so one of the main things that we learned in this is that where government responses, our state and tribal, even tribal, our federal mechanisms fall short, what really rises to the occasion to support our communities is our kinship values, our clan systems, and our lifeways, and our ability to be resilient in the face of overwhelming obstacles. And so when we were building the infrastructure, it wasn't, there was no one operating in isolation. Even if that may have been what it felt like in the beginning with a lot of mutual aid groups, suddenly it became clear that we had so much wealth of knowledge, of resources, of expertise that was spouting out all over our reservation, and people from different sectors coming together to reroot ourselves in our traditional life ways and our understanding of our kinship and our connection and responsibility to each other, to reconnect with our history with historical pandemics, and to reconnect to those lessons and all of the ways that they informed the need to respond, both using our traditional medicines, but also using our cultural teachings, and really highlighting and reviving our kinship structures in order to take care of each other. And so I think that regardless of how this pandemic has went through our reservation, continues as we're in the midst of the second wave, as we continue to really have to carry all of these multiple balls and these multiple fronts. One of the beautiful things that has come out of this is everyone's commitment to self-sustainability and to reviving and continuing to reviving those cultural practices for long-term recovery. So I'm really excited for what this moment has brought and how it has awoken us up to build better solutions.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Janene. You touch on so many things that I think about in terms of like connecting the on the ground struggle and the overwhelming part of it. And I think that's something that probably, I'm assuming a lot of folks listening in are sharing that sense of both grief and the overwhelming kind of feeling of the weight that we're carrying right now. But then also how that on some level can be galvanizing. It reminds me of Standing Rock a little bit in that way too, of how that, the immediacy of the thought of the crisis of the pipeline going through these communities brought people together. And I think too, I mean, on one sense, it's, also raises one of the things that I'm most concerned about at this juncture as we head into this next wave, particularly as we see that the worst hotspots being like North and South Dakota and then the Navajo Reservation, and the loss of elders. I think that's particularly the space that I'm in right now because that's sort of the work that I'm doing. And so our reliance on those ways that you talk about, the repositories, sort of our own form of an archive in a sense, is also being decimated in certain ways. But it also, I agree with you. There's also sort of a sense of hope there, and it makes me think, Valerie, a lot of your work in that at some point we have to find ways to kind of channel this grief and the overwhelming sensibility, the taxing on the existing structures or lack of structure, but in a way maybe there's wider recognition of the kind of lack of infrastructure. And Valerie, the work that you've been doing in the Indigenous Teacher Education Project gives me that hope, because that's exactly, to me, I mean, you'll speak of it, but to me, that's exactly the underlying problematic is how do we teach, like how do we not just teach about kind of the current conditions and the history of those conditions, but also young people and ourselves, as teachers and educators of various kinds, about, how to sort of channel that understanding and that knowledge into, generating new forms and ways of resistance. So I'm wondering, Val, if you can talk about just what you're seeing too on the ground in terms of the impact of this moment on your students, on your project, on your work, on the communities that you work with.
Okay. Yeah, good to see you. Good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Sandy. Very happy to be on this panel with Janene and Sandy, and being a part of this series on Indigenous methodologies. And like Janene, I too have been influenced by your work of Red Pedagogy, and Red Pedagogy has been the driving force behind the kind of work that I do in teacher education. And, you know, in thinking about the coalitional forces, for example, of, you know, white supremacy with patriarchy and with capitalism, those forces combined ideologically have designed the schooling structures that we're in right now, for example. And, you know, in terms of this kind of work that we're preparing the Indigenous teachers for, and ITEP is really a space that's created for preparing Native teachers to teach Native students in Native communities. And because, you know, it really has to do with this idea of Native nation building, and that when we build our nations through the youth and the teachers creating forms of curriculum that will get their students to examine some of the present day inequities and injustices that are caused by those coalitional forces that I mentioned earlier. Teachers tend to think of those injustices of colonialism as in the past. And so what has brought about in terms of this current climate is that it still exists. And those topics, those issues have been at the forefront of some of our conversations within ITEP. For example, we have, Janene mentioned the Bears Ears, and I think this administration currently had been really working to exploit some of the land and natural resources as well as extract for profit. And so getting the teacher candidates to utilize those topics as curriculum in the classroom would get their students to examine these structures. And, you know, alongside that, because land, Indigenous knowledge is embedded within our land. And so there's the convergence of Indigenous knowledge systems that would get embedded within such a curriculum in examining these current issues happening today. And, you know, just getting the teacher candidates to really unpack these structures historically that will really get them to see the structures and to recognize these structures, because we've all been through schooling systems. And it's become so natural and internalized that we tend to not question it and accept that that's just the way schools are done. And so really going back to getting the teacher candidates to see those structures and to deconstruct those to the point where they begin to really reconceptualize what it could be for their own Native students in their own classrooms, drawing on, you know, their Indigenous knowledge systems in relation to some of the current issues that are happening within their communities. For example, I'm coming to you from the Dana Atem and Pasquayaki Ueme lands, and in the area there's the border wall that's happening, and that's been one of the topics that we've been discussing in classes with the teacher candidates. And, you know, having to console students, you know, Dana Atem students, for example, because the Hashan, the saguaro cactus, is their connection, it's their ancestors. And, you know, having to be able to console students in that process, in the moment, the same way that we're having to console the students who are battling the COVID-19 right now and their relatives in their communities. And so, you know, there's the current climate that's really impacting our students. And so we have to be there for them, you know, because the work that we do is coming from the heart, and they themselves are really working with a purpose. They have a purpose in mind of teaching their students, but when some of these things are happening in their communities, they're time and attention is diverted to that. Another issue that we've been, the current climate with COVID-19 has impacted us is that our students are, inequities have been exposed because of the rural places where our students are Zooming into classes, Wi-Fi issues. And some students, for example, had to drive to the nearest grocery store just to connect to Wi-Fi, which was 20 to 30 minutes away for some of the students. And I think that also led to us on our part as the university and having tapping into some of the resources at the university. It led to conversations with colleagues, faculty here and in other colleges around broadband and broadband infrastructure and how we can begin addressing some of the solutions for the students, because they had to attend their classes. They had to finish out the spring semester, for example, last spring. And, it's started the conversations around some of the inequities, but also some of the solutions as well. And it's not only the students, it's the teachers, the native teachers that we work with as well. They're having to, teach in a new way of teaching like everyone else, but it's really about seeing and witnessing the kinds of other inequities that exist within the students' homes that, I think have to also be considered, that not other communities consider as well. For example, how many students are in a household and trying to connect to Wi-Fi. And we've been working specifically with the Hopi community in terms of starting with their community and trying to address some of the infrastructure issues and finding solutions for that. So, there's all kinds of other issues, and there's, the Black Lives Matter current climate right now, the immigration with children in the cages. And, there's all of these different topics that we have been discussing within our classes that really help illuminate in their eyes that, neocolonial forms of injustices still exist in the current day. And so I think that's a lot of the work that we're doing right now, is really getting our teachers to see that, and then to reconceptualize a different way of teaching within their classroom.
Thank you so much for that, Valerie, for sharing. I think what comes across from both of your kind of narrations of what's happening is, on the one hand, this really clarifying sense of purpose that has been, animating in maybe positive directions, as well as a recognition of current inequities. So it isn't that inequities don't matter, especially when we're talking about access to water in the middle of a pandemic, or clean water in the middle of a pandemic, or Wi-Fi when all of schooling has moved to this new platform. Certainly those things matter, but that's not what defines Native peoples as peoples or communities. And what they have, what they do have in terms of the resources is orientation, maybe, I don't know, for lack of a better word right now, toward collectivity, toward caring for and making kin and kind of centering relations, which has enabled, whatever has been able to been staved off in terms of death has really been at the work of communities for their own communities, or what students and teachers have been able to kind of experience in terms of ongoing education in this moment has really been primarily of their own doing. And when I think right now in this moment, when I think of what seems impoverished, it really is the complete, seeming anyway, complete and utter lack in other spaces for there to be a sense of a collective well-being or good. To me, that's what seems really impoverished, where folks can't seem to, whether it's the hoarding of toilet paper and water, or like getting on a plane and traveling for some crazy holiday as an expression of their right or something, or not wearing a mask. I mean, it's infuriating, but it also seems like just an impoverished way of being from my vantage point. And so that's another sense of maybe inequity I hope to kind of like bring to the forefront. And in that sense, if we imagine kind of, or not just imagine, but if we think about kind of the ability to kind of organize as a collective, as sort of a community-informed Indigenous methodology. And if you could like both think again in more specificity about what kinds of community-based approaches or practices or principles do you integrate into the work that you're doing right now? So I guess phrased a little differently, it's like, what is your own practice or Indigenous kind of bringing Indigenous methodologies to life?
Well, for me, it's still a learning process, because I'm in no way a traditional knowledge holder or someone that has that in-depth like cultural understanding of how our knowledge systems can be used in this way. And so my process is really leaning on and relying on my elders to guide me. And I know that can kind of seem cliche to say, especially when we're from Indigenous communities, right? We all have our secret like elders that we rely on. But in a very real way, I think to speak to what you brought up in your last comments about the way this inequality is manifesting in an individual behavior or individualistic behavior, it really is a lesson in humility and in stepping back and in taking time, even in the midst of all this chaos, to not be swept up in that chaos, but to be patient and to try to see the whole picture and what's going on. And I think that that's a phenomenal lesson to hold on to for anyone and everyone in this moment, because a lot of what has come to be and these systemic issues that we're dealing with has deep, deep roots. So deep that sometimes when we're reactionary, actually almost every time we're reactionary and responding to a problem as it presents itself, we're actually further reinforcing the system. And so to give an example around the discussion of broadband, because the Navajo Nation, I think, used a significant portion of their CARES Act funding to support broadband deployment across the Navajo Nation. And there's two things that was ignored in all of this. One, the Navajo Nation has fiber throughout most major communities across the Navajo Nation that's never been lit because of contract conflicts with the company that laid that fiber, and because broadband is a different type of community infrastructure that isn't completely tied into the settler colonial legal frameworks around jurisdiction and right-of-way authorities and regulatory policies that other forms of infrastructure are. But that's an opportunity that we're not really jumping on, because with the Navajo Nation and the use of CARES Act funds, I think they contracted Verizon or AT&T, one of these companies, to come in and deploy the broadband. Ignoring the fact that it's not just about access, it's about sovereignty. It's about exercising sovereignty. It's about recognizing we don't have this infrastructure, not because we didn't have the wherewithal to plan for that infrastructure, but because of these systemic barriers that keep us from owning this infrastructure in our own lands. Because of the barriers of access to these fields of scholarship, of education, that would build the workforce we need to take ownership over this infrastructure. And so when we focus on things like that, reacting to the problems as that's being presented, one of the things we lose out on is recognition that in other countries where they have place-based education models, and where the majority of their schooling is outdoors, are community-led, for example, they did not experience this disruption in education because of this pandemic. And instead of looking at models like that and thinking about, there's some resiliency here and there's some lessons to be gained here that maybe we should be incorporating into our communities, we're looking at how to connect people through problematic companies that have been known and have had countless cases against them for exploiting poor communities of color, for data mining in very harmful ways, for participating in state and federal surveillance of land rights and human rights advocates. And these are real threats that I think outweigh the benefits of getting everyone connected to do a new form of learning that takes us further away from the type of educational models that our people are already inherently experts at. And so some of the communities that we've been helping with, their priority is also not education right now. Like their priority is keeping themselves safe and keeping our elders safe. And when a lot of our elders are the sole caretakers of children and they can't navigate these barriers around technology, even when they do have access, they're opting to the in-person schooling options that are being offered to them in Arizona in particular. And that puts them at risk, because we know from the research out there that children can spread the virus without presenting symptoms of the virus. And so when we're talking about trying to protect our elders, we really have to look at the whole picture and really, as much as possible, cultivate the humility and the discipline to not be reactive. And in the moment where everyone is grappling with these issues about race, about white supremacy, about sexism, really ensuring that any strategies we're building for COVID response, for COVID relief, for COVID recovery has that intersectional lens so that we're not replicating these cycles and these harms. And I really think that as our tribal governments have an extraordinary responsibility to look at this as a whole. Because right now we need to, and what we're seeing is that tribal government responses are also not being informed by our cultural knowledge systems. And a brief example about how Indigenous methodologies can help us in how we respond to issues like this is the naming of COVID. For Navajo, it's Tikos Nintsa, which is like the big cough, right? And we've had meeting after meeting with traditional knowledge holders, our Medicine Men's Association, our medicine keepers, who talk about different lessons that we've learned from previous pandemics, where we're not supposed to name something that we don't quite understand, that we're supposed to wait. And we saw in real time what the harm was in just translating something from English into Navajo without really taking that time to think about it and really apply our cultural lens in the process of what that naming practice needs to look like. So that our elders, when they're being told this is what this is called in Navajo, they're like, oh, it's just a cough. It's just a fever. Or it's just a flu. It's just the same thing as a cold. When really, like, this is something much different than that. And so the names that our medicine keepers are using now are much more deeper and profound and more reflective of what this virus actually does, not only to an individual when they catch it, but to community when we're losing our relatives to this. And we can't mourn and grieve in the same ways that we used to because of these restrictions for in-person gatherings. And so I think that from the beginning in naming a problem all the way to developing the solutions, this is where Indigenous perspectives, frameworks, worldviews, epistemologies, and methodological approaches are so valuable and important for informing appropriate responses and strategies for how to react and how to build solutions to the issues that we're facing. And so one of the ways that the name has been translated, the name that our medicine keepers are using now, it takes in the environment as a whole. It doesn't describe this virus as something that just affects your lungs. it describes this virus as coming from this imbalance in our environment, right? So linking it to climate change, the way that it should be. And it describes the way that it attacks your body and your spirit as an individual and as a collective. And I think that if we had that naming process beforehand, our responses would have already been different, would have been informed differently, rather than replicating things that were coming down from the federal and state level when we knew already that those were inadequate. And I think that, you know, as we move forward and think about recovery, this is something we need to hold center and hold at the core of what recovery looks like for us and what healing looks like. And in the conversations that have been happening now, one of the main things that comes up is that we, like, before we can even talk about recovery, we have to create a process and a way to grieve everything that was taken from us during this pandemic. You know, like, we've just been counting up losses right now. And even in the midst of this pandemic, dealing with issues of the loss of water systems, because people needing to use more and more water for their daily lives has overstressed a lot of community wells when we had no rains this rainy season. So like that confluence of climate change, of the pandemics and systemic injustices and oppressions have all created this impact on our mental, emotional, and our cultural well-being that needs to be addressed if we're to get to a place to have a strong enough foundation to really imagine and co-create what the solutions and the recovery looks like. Mm-hmm. And our Indigenous methodologies have the keys to help us through that process.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Janene. That's so illustrative of some of the kind of fundamental tensions. And it makes me think of, actually in Quechua, there's this notion of the aikachi also, which is like, sounds similar, where you're not supposed to touch or name or something unless you know more about it, and that knowing takes time. And it makes me think of when you have ways of being that hold at its center relations and relationality, primarily, you know, as Val reminded us, as they come through land and water, I'd say. You know, when you think about land, those are things, and water, those are things that have existed since time immemorial and have grown and changed over hundreds and thousands of years. And so it's a way of organizing life that really isn't oriented around time, and therefore not efficiencies and transactions. When you're oriented around relationality, it's like, by definition, you're talking about a more complex process. You're talking about something that it unfolds over long periods, and so requires patience. I say this as one of the most impatient people I know also, because we all live in this crazy, so like it really speaks to me when you talk about you have to really kind of resist the chaos and resist the reactionary part. But then it also speaks to me, I think it's Iris Mannion Young's work, again, for educators out there, who talks about the definition of oppression is basically all your choices suck. So if you go for broadband, whatever, and kind of try to fix the lack of access for schooling, then you're screwed. If you don't, and like you do that, like there's no choice in which the ultimate outcome isn't further denigration of one's community. And so that's often the space we find ourselves in. And so, and in particular, when we think about folks on the front lines of in many different ways, of which teachers are one, you know, what kinds of options or what kinds of conversations are we having for them when they have young people, you know, right in front of them who are struggling, who will continue to be measured by those oppressive, you know, measures of test scores or whatever that will lead them to continue to be denied certain things, including their own sense of humanity and personhood. And so, I mean, we certainly can just, we can also, though, develop other systems of being. It would have been, you know, this could have been an opportunity to really just shut down and do things differently, use the kind of mandates that continue to circulate around schooling right now, which is just mind-blowing, whether it's still requiring, I don't know, what did they do last spring, the GRE or the I don't even know what, the different tests, the SAT and all that kind of stuff. So everything like ongoing as if nothing is happening, as if people are dying. But in part, it's only some people that are dying, right? So we're still in this sort of genocidal calculus, or that sort of pie that I started talking about. It's just like a basic understanding that, you know, where the whole entire project is based around some will have and some will not, and that you have to buy into that. At the same time, it's a super seductive drug if you're one that is given one of those big pieces of pie, something that we're all vulnerable to and at times complicit in. So Val, help us out here. How do we work our way, especially teachers like in the classroom again that are really like right there having to kind of figure it out. What kinds of conversations are you having, or you know, what kind of practices are you integrating? I know the stuff that you were doing even before a pandemic, which is tending to the relations among your students in so many ways, not just while you see them in the classroom, but I know that, but if you could share with others how you enact those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, building a collective, it takes time, and it's a collective that teaches and thinks a certain way. And so, you know, we've been really intentional in the way we designed our program to prepare these teachers. And in particular, you know, there are certain concerns and issues that need to be addressed through education. And I think teachers have the capacity to be able to do that in the classroom and to teach their students, you know, to develop a critical consciousness around some of these concerns that are happening. And I think there's a lot of strength in our communities, you know, and with the indigenous knowledges and languages that exist, the philosophies, those fundamental worldviews, those are our strengths. And a lot of times the teachers have varying levels and degrees of knowledge associated with their, you know, their cultural epistemologies. And just having them reflect on the legacy of, you know, colonialism and how assimilation and how that has impacted them personally, but also the community, and to really ground themselves in that space and how they've been impacted. And when we do that, I think we tend to have a more broad collective idea around how we can approach teaching. And drawing on some of these indigenous knowledge systems, we struggled, you know, the teachers struggled with that because of what they know and what they don't know. And to be a teacher who centers that, because that's what the work of ITEP does, is how do we center indigenous knowledge systems that have been marginalized historically, and center that, because that's curriculum, those are our stories. And, you know, curriculum is knowledge, and our stories are knowledge. And so when we think about how we can center that, we're thinking about the core of our origin stories or creation stories, and how those can be integrated but into the education of our students, of our youth, so that they can then become more grounded in those thought processes moving forward, which competes with the capitalistic idea of individualism, you know, being competitive, that's so embedded within schooling structures. And so we actually have our students go through this process of examining their identities, and then have conversations. Last week, for example, we talked about how some of the students it's the end of the semester, and how some of the students were thinking about how they didn't have much confidence at the beginning when they started the program to center their Indigenous knowledge systems, but now they're thinking about ways that they could do that because the knowledge exists within the community. And so, you know, opening up the walls of the classroom, inviting them in, or going out to be in that space of where the knowledge exists. And all teachers can develop a critical consciousness in their students. And, you know, we had to have a conversation around that. So critical consciousness around some of these issues of power and oppression, and how do you get your students to unpack that and understand that from kindergarten through 8th grade, because we're elementary school teachers. And so all teachers are able to do that. We tell them that, but it's the level of knowledge and confidence one has, so they have to go and seek that out and bring that knowledge to the students themselves. One of the other Indigenous principles that we've drawn on in our work is to rely on our philosophies and Diné philosophy in planning ITEP as a program itself. One of them is this idea of a philosophy of life in terms of four stages or processes, and one out of the four, well, the four are Ntsahakes, which is thinking, Nahata, which is planning, Ina, which is living and implementing and applying, and Sehasin, which is reflecting and evaluating. So for ITEP, when we're drawing on those kinds of principles to create and develop a new program, we're thinking about, in Ntsahakes, how are we thinking about the unique social and political context of our communities, Indigenous communities? And how do we prepare the teachers to understand that and to restructure an existing elementary education program that is more reflective of those contexts? So in Ntsahakes, our thinking, you know, we're also thinking about how we can draw on our, you know, philosophies, the fundamental philosophies and worldviews, and how those inform our thought processes. We're thinking about Nahata, which is planning. What do we want our teachers to be able to do in this program? And how do we get them there to that point? So, you know, the design of the classes, the readings, and even the implementation is, they're in these classes, a sequence of classes with my colleague, Dr. Jeremy Garcia, and I. We, you know, co-teach these classes because we have a certain vision and idea of what we want these teachers to be able to do. And then, of course, we're constantly having conversations which reflect Sehasin, is the reflecting and evaluating. So those, you know, Diné principles, from my perspective, have guided the uniqueness of how we prepare the Indigenous teachers within our program.
Very powerful. Thank you, Valerie. And as we head into this last round of questions, I just want to invite those who are listening to start dropping your questions into the Q&A so that we have some ready to go. I'll just add, Val, what your thoughts make me think of is, and some things that have emerged in this conversation, is how connection to purpose is really critical. Connection to purpose and to community is really fundamental in learning anything. So in school, in the context of schooling, like if you know, where so much of learning goes on in this decontextualized way, learning for learning's sake, learning decontextualized facts, you know, the way we learn math, I think it's just horrible. But sorry if there's any math teachers out there. But you know what to, and children, I think of you know, all kinds of backgrounds, often at some point in school ask the question of like, why do I need to know this? So I think it's like within all of us, like, what is the purpose of this knowledge? And then how do we learn that? And then learning within, in a manner in which that one's learning is contingent about somebody else's learning, I think is critically important. Sorry, that's my dad's phone. I just think that, you know, holding those things centrally is something that we can all do moving forward. So in this last round, Janene, you've talked already a little bit about how do we move to, I guess, for lack of a better sense, like the space of healing, and that we can't really get there until we grieve first. And I think that's really important for us to think about. But I'm curious about what others, so we don't just leave with this heavy weight. Like, what other things do you think about when we think about how do we move through, I don't want to say past, but through this space right now that feels very heavy, that's still mounting. You know, there's still sadly probably some grief to come. But how do we start thinking about healing, I guess, in a way? Janene?
You know, in our work, and I work with a group of phenomenal knowledge holders and elders through a coalition of sorts that we've created called Diné Centered Research and Evaluation. And we've been tackling different issues from that perspective of how do you conduct Indigenous-led research that centers our epistemologies. And one of the things that we're working on prior to COVID was mapping out all of the fields of struggles and resistance that we're dealing with. Everything from the environmental and like all the impacts and activities around extractive industries, the privatization of land and the conflicts that that's created and the disharmony that it's brought into communities, to the assimilation of our peoples into Western thoughts and frameworks that has had a very negative impact on their spiritual and cultural well-being, to the issues faced by families and the endemic social, political, economic issues that bring that hold families hostage under poverty, under systemic and internalized violence, under gender-based violence, to, you know, how all of this affects the community and the well-being of the community as a whole. And so we were already empowered and have the tools of looking at and evaluating things in that way. So when COVID came into the mix, it was a natural folding into this sort of universal holistic approach into how do we look at and respond to this pandemic. And so as a result of that, we've been helping and working with people to inform different responses. We've also started and developed our own mutual aid networks. And in all of this, what it's reinforced is that in the previous learnings and in looking and mapping out all of these issues, one of the things that we bottom lined in what would set Indigenous methodologies and research approaches apart from Western approaches among all of the other different paradigms was a core question of how does this enable you to be a better relative and to be a good ancestor? And like, what does that mean? You know, and there's so many different ways to define that, but that's what we center in all of our approaches. And so when we take that lesson and apply it to this context that we're living in, where things kind of seem even magnified and even more overwhelming than usual because of just what we're juggling all at once, we still hold that question center. How do we hold and ourselves accountable to being a good relative in this moment and beyond? And so I think that for me has been really illuminating and empowering, because not only does it help us break through the noise of all of the issues and challenges created by just systemic oppression in general, the pervasiveness of white supremacy in our Indigenous communities, as well as in our outside, in the outside communities, the non-Indigenous communities, by really helping us focus our energies on things first that we have complete power and control over. And that is, how do we structure our individual actions in this moment to be of most use and help to our families, to our communities, and to our environment? And then how do we then build that collective, like Valerie is saying, which takes time, but how do we then feed that in building the collective and nurturing the collective that a lot of us are already a part of, whether we define it that way or not, right? Like, how do we nurture that collective to center this healing and this resiliency for ourselves, regardless of what's going on. Because the reality is, like, these issues were created by Democratic and Republican administrations, right? Like right now, our tribal government is led by a Democrat and a Republican that are both evangelists. I don't know if I said that right, but evangelists who vetoed CARES Act funding that was being proposed for our traditional medicine keepers to conduct ceremonies of healing and of offering to bring back balance to our communities and to individuals who have experienced enormous loss. And so, as infuriating and as overwhelming as those types of things still are, that our power doesn't have to be tied up in that. Regardless, we are continuing forward by centering that knowledge, by finding other ways to offer those services for ourselves, for each other, and by sharing this knowledge with other people, so that we can demonstrate in real time that the things that we have been conditioned to be ashamed of as Indigenous peoples, our life ways, our ways of knowing, our epistemologies, our creation stories, our ways of doing things and of relating to each other, are actually a strength when all of these systems are at its weakest. And this is the seed of hope that we can nurture and then we can take care of despite all of these obstacles. And this is what we'll always have, regardless of what happens or does not happen with the Biden administration. Like, this is something that we'll always have and that is accessible to everyone. And I think that on one hand, even though we're experiencing extraordinary loss of our elders and our knowledge holders, we're also experiencing a very real awakening in our young people, a powerful awakening in our young people to be more committed than ever, not just in a superficial way, which I think was whether we knew it or not, was what a lot of us were doing with our cultural performance. But to really understand in a deeper philosophical way, in an ethical way, in a way that informs our morals and our sense of responsibility to live a meaningful life, we are bringing back those lessons and soaking them up, so that even though we are losing our knowledge holders, we're building a whole new generation of knowledge holders that's able to speak to these issues, these problems, the infrastructure and like the modern challenges that we're seeing with that wisdom. And I think that that's where we're going to see Indigenous peoples and the movement of Indigenous peoples going forward, and how we define and reclaim what self-determination, what sovereignty looks like. And it's happening with that healing. And so I think that that I didn't want to leave everyone with a heavy note, but I can't ignore that we are still carrying this grief and this loss. But part of what that's done is that it's awakened something in our DNA. Like, just as historical trauma has been proved to be inherited, and then the way that this experience has awakened that, so has awakened our resiliency, our survival instincts, and our gifts for creation. And I think that that's where we're really going to find our strength as we move forward.
Yeah, wow, thank you, Janene, for that. And I just want to say, I didn't want to suggest too that, which is why I said didn't want to say move past, but I think the grief it's part of it, right? I think lots of our cycles within our own communities and our ways of knowing is that cycle through death and birth that we relive lots of different ways through our ceremonies, through everything. And so it's really about embracing it in a way, or just understanding the importance and significance of it, but also where do we cultivate kind of the resolve to kind of have the patience to wait, to not just wait idly, but kind of move through it and understand and kind of have our sights on, what's to come. Valerie.
Yes.
Healing.
Healing, yes. We focus on language. We focus on revitalizing our, own proficiencies within language. And every Friday we have a session and we focus on building that through different games, different ideas. I don't know if you've ever, for example, heard of Chatterbox. It's a paper, like an origami paper, and you can open it back and forth, and it has like words inside of it. So my daughter Sunwise, she really loves that game, and she's engaging in that with us, and she's really motivated, and it's my responsibility as her mother to also be able to teach her. So, you know, alongside that, in developing our languages, that's where the deep connections and understanding of our epistemologies lie. Like, what does it mean to be in that state of hojon, or in the Navajo context of harmony and balance in such, you know, in such a space like this, in a climate like this. And for us, because we focus on curriculum, developing curriculum from within, we focus on empowering our youth to make change. If that's the outcome, then how do we do that? And, you know, the teacher candidates right now, they're as stressed out as they might be right now because it's finals week or approaching finals. They are engaging in healing work, and to be able to develop curriculum based off of feminism or ideas around red land, white power, you know, environmental issues and injustices like that. You know, they're pretty stressed out right now. But what they're doing is they're engaging in theories that will inform how they might teach certain topics within a curriculum, and making connections from history to the present day. And when we're thinking about, you know, healing, we're doing it for our students and our communities, and to kind of just alleviate that level of stress and anxiety about engaging in projects like this of developing curriculum. It's always going to be centered in the future of, you know, the youth and the communities. How does this work contribute to that? And they become more inspired and more ready to engage in that. And, you know, I think having mentors who help along the way with either Indigenous knowledge systems, incorporating that, or helping mentors who might help unpack some of these theoretical ideas around Marxism, for example, and how that informs their thoughts and ideas around curriculum. I think, you know, it's going to come together beautifully, but it's a process, and they're going to struggle with it. But that struggle for healing is really embedded within our students and our communities.
Nice, beautiful. So I guess we're at the Q&A portion of the program. So I don't know if you're going to there. Yay.
Hi. Thank you for this really incredible panel so far. I do have some questions from the audience that I'm going to be reading. And the first one is, as a community leader and parent, it's important to me that our local school district work in a manner that is conducive to decolonizing the curriculum in our learning spaces. What are some strategies I can utilize to overcome the idea that this is a process we can continue to delay?
Just trying to understand the last portion of that. So it sounds like she's trying, or they're trying to say, how can we communicate the urgency behind this?
Yeah, that's what I'm also getting from it.
I mean, I'll be really quick and curious what Janene, you and Valerie have to share as well. I mean, so decolonization, you know, for me, those conversations can't happen without understanding that the primary condition of decolonization is land, Indigenous land, and its return to those communities. And But then it's also to understand that land in addition to that kind of material return, which I think is important, but people often think is inconceivable, but it isn't, is as we've talked about today, that land is also a relation, and that you cannot, and that land is a relation that conditions, one's relationship to land is one that it's primary. So it's one that conditions all other relations. And so to build a little bit off what Janene said earlier is, if schools, so to me, decolonize the curriculum is really like, it's much more profound than like, let's swap in this book or let's celebrate this person. Those are kind of models of inclusion, not decolonization. But if the sole purpose of schooling is reframed to be, how does this help us be good relatives and good ancestors, as Janene said, as opposed to like centered on one's individual career. I want to be an engineer, or even the notion of social mobility. This will enable me to. Those are all sort of transactional ways of looking at education, and reductionist, really, and clearly not a project that served us very well, given where we are. But if everything that one does in a classroom is really in response to that question, how you do science, how you do math. I think it was just today, I missed it, but there's the woman senator, I think, or representative. She always has the whiteboard to do like the math of like how, I don't know, pharmaceutical companies are profiting off whatever. And I always thought, like, if she was my math teacher, I probably would have had a chance at learning math, because she's connecting math to a purpose, to a broader purpose. And not just a exercise and memorization, or like some, math changes every year, it seems, and what the process is, but it's connected to something else bigger than all of us, teaching us how to be and do good in this world. That's the kind of math I want to learn. That's decolonial to me.
Yeah, I have a lot of experience fighting with our school systems in different ways, a lot of failures from that. So as a community leader and a parent, I think your strongest position is as a parent and advocating for changes to curriculum. And we tried to start out big, because obviously, like, we had to check our own privilege too. Me and my husband were Ivy League educated, coming back to the res, and like on top of my son and my daughter's schooling. And so we're always questioning and like wanting to see the curriculum. We were those parents, and I'm sure we did not make the teachers' lives any easier, and I feel really bad for them. But I realized that advocacy, out of necessity, it has to happen at all levels. And I realized as a parent, my advocacy on the front lines of climate change, of systemic violence and injustice, and just all these extreme forms of oppression, was just as important as my advocacy as a mother, and ensuring that our school systems were being held accountable. Because a lot of times these myths that are perpetuated through our education system are allowed to endure because it's happening under this veil of parents feeling like they don't have the power to vocalize what needs to change and what shifts need to be made in their children's education. And so as a parent, I took my community organizing skills and brought that to these spaces to really help recruit other parents and organize the parent groups as an advocacy group, and really, make the superintendent's life hell, because that is our babies. Those are our babies. And what is being taught to them is going to impact them for the rest of their lives. And so when we're still living in a time where children are being told and to make headdresses in kindergarten and first grade to celebrate Thanksgiving, and the teacher comes in dressed as a pilgrim, like, the change can start with a small movement of being like, that is not okay. That is unacceptable. And if you need a policy to inform your teachers that this is unacceptable, draft that up, put it on the next school board agenda, and get it done. Because like Sandy said, the decolonization project is much bigger. It's going to take a lot of time, but there are things there's our pressure points we can push to create the context that's necessary to have constructive conversations about why this is so important to us. But as a community leader, one of the things that we did too was that we decentralized after school activities. So I'm not sure what nation you're from, but from the Navajo Nation, we have sub-government units that are known as chapters, and a school district, a public school district, for example, can cover 5 to 6 of those communities. And so we went around and got resolutions passed in our school district to offer tutoring services and to contract elders from the community to come in and be classroom monitors, our classroom support, and to also advocate if there were any teaching assistant positions, that would also be opened up to elders from our community, even if they didn't meet the quote unquote teacher requirements. Obviously everyone would have to go through and meet the background requirements, background checks, right? But if there were other things that we could push or we could amend in order to open up those opportunities for more of our community leaders, our community knowledge holders, we found them and we fought for them. And so by the time my son left that school district, I think the majority of the middle school classrooms had an elder in their classrooms that would help maintain order, that would provide support services for the students, because there's a lot of emotional support that's needed for our students going through these systems. And so I think it's just that mapping out, like, where do you have power? Where do you have the most immediate ability to enact an action? And how can you start to push those pressure points and organize other people to do that with you?
Yeah, and absolutely. To add on to the idea of building a collective consciousness, building a collective requires dialogue. It requires, just having various people at the table talking about their experiences with schooling, for example. And I think for us, we talk about how we could do that, to bring in these different stories of elders, of community members in general, and their experiences with schooling. And some of them might not necessarily be good experiences for them, but to bring that to the table and to have conversations around and to allow the time and space for that to happen. And so I think collectively everyone's hearing that, and collectively everyone's going to think about their own ideas and ways of reconceptualizing the current structure of schooling in certain spaces. And so having conversations about the kind of curriculum that's embedded in schools, if they're predominantly curriculum programs or textbooks, those are not going to include, Indigenous perspectives and stories. So how do we begin to have that dialogue around ideas for bringing those stories forward in that process of trying to work toward decolonizing a curriculum, decolonizing a school? It's about restructuring all of that. Because as I mentioned earlier, everyone has their own common sense thoughts and ideas about what schooling is. So it's about disrupting that as well, and re-envisioning and reconceptualizing new ways of education for the youth.
Star, I wonder if you could read a few questions so that, and maybe we could each take a different one. I just want to make sure people's questions that responded to.
Absolutely.
Can.
Well, we have a question from Dr. Darren Renko, who actually hosted one of these sessions on decolonizing Indigenous methodologies. And he asks, what concrete suggestions might you have to implement the ideas you have so powerfully presented today in our tribal and non-tribal institutions here in Maine? So I don't know if somebody in particular wants to take that question.
Concrete suggestions. Okay. I mean, I guess for me, ultimately, it's people often focus on content. And I really encourage a shifting in consciousness. So to get super concrete, one exercise I used to do with my students who were, overwhelmed just learning how to be a teacher in a classroom and then trying to learn how to do that through a critical and/or Indigenous lens was often even more overwhelming. But if you think about the most simplistic sort of understanding of teaching as this exchange of knowledge. And we take something really simple. A student once said, well, I'll pick something really simple like rice. And I said, okay, so in a really sort of transactional positivist method, you might teach children about the properties of rice. It's a grain, where is it in the food pyramid, whatever, and they memorize it. In sort of the multicultural version, you might think about, there's different rice around the world. How do different peoples and communities, what kind of rice do they eat? And you have like a potluck or something. And they usually can get to like the point of equity where they think about like, oh, who has rice is the question, like who has access to food and like food deserts. And then you might, study those kinds of things, but kind of shifting to a more kind of indigenous / maybe decolonial lens. You think about what is our relationship to rice? In other words, if we think of, rice fields as a relation to those who grow rice, what has to happen in that community for, good rice, healthy rice through, maintaining healthy water systems? How does that happen? And I think just taking through teachers' understanding is it's not so much because the content in all those things has stayed the same. The mandate, let's say, is to teach rice, right? You can do that in all these different ways. But students are learning fundamentally really different things. And so it's just something that if you can get into that sort of framework as a teacher to take yourself through those different kinds of models and understand their distinctions, maybe it's a beginning to help you kind of reshape your classroom.
Can I just add to that, Sandy, that, in terms of relationships, in almost every single Indigenous community, there are environmental issues happening with the land. And so what are some of those issues happening in the context of Maine or the surrounding areas? And how might those be topics of curriculum that teachers can develop? What are the multiple perspectives around this? What are the Indigenous connections and relationships to these aspects of the environment? And then how might we engage the youth and the students, the youth and the teachers in working towards solutions for addressing some of these issues? So I would add that as another concrete example.
Mm-hmm.
And just to build off both these suggestions, I find that there's a lot more potential to do bigger shifts with tribally owned or tribally run institutions when you make those efforts through the policy pathway. And there's a lot of examples already out there that exist both within the US and outside the US about what an Indigenous-led curriculum looks like and what those policy measures that helped open the door for the development of those models look like as well. And I think that that's one of the things we can do, like across the board in my experience, the biggest steps, the biggest first and most meaningful first steps that were taken have done is exactly what Sandy's talking about, is just look for the ways to create those relations to place. And like Valerie said, like there's all these opportunities, and there's also all this language already in the educational field in particular, like place-based education, socio-emotional development, culturally responsive education or culturally appropriate education, alternative methodologies, that these all fit under and can be used as a doorway to invite in these alternative education models. But at the end of the day, everything is going to lead back to the necessity for having policy changes to implement those shifts.
All right. Would you like me to do another question before we do the
one round? Sure, yeah.
Okay. Let's see. So what is your biggest priority for how teachers can incorporate Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing into concrete, i.e. Teaching more about Indigenous peoples and histories, but also into the pedagogy and classroom practice overall? So that's a kind of a long one, but it's the first question if you click on the Q&A at the top. But
I think in some ways we maybe have responded to that.
I think you actually did, yes. I'm really into that now.
But yeah, connection in one word. Is there another one maybe?
Let me read the one from our executive director, Chris Newell. I like to challenge the English terminology when discussing Native histories and contemporary issues. Words like wilderness, pioneer, and frontier are extremely problematic to re-indigenizing educational processes. I use it as an entry point for Native and non-Native educators to begin the process of how to explore their own implicit biases embedded in the English language and deconstruct them. What other entry points what are some other entry points that you use in your own work?
I think I'm gonna shift to Janene or Val. I felt that sort of little story about rice is sort of my entry point, but I would also, you know, underscore what Val said earlier about language, that using terms in one's own Indigenous language or a Indigenous language, there's so much embedded there about how we're really thinking about completely different ways of being. There's words in our languages that don't exist in English for a reason. So I think, you know, using language often to illustrate concepts is helpful. Any other entry points? It's okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, because I do teach students who are not Native as well in the teacher education program here at the university. And you know, I think one of the first things that we do is challenge deficit language and really focus on the strengths and assets that exist within all communities. And so being aware of those and then thinking about the ways that they can tap into those strengths and assets by the community members themselves and through the students' lived experiences, and bringing those in and not seeing those as deficits. And, you know, I think not focusing so much time on that language, but moving it into language of like some sort of action, transformative action of how do we get our, you know, how do we move toward political action or social action. And, you know, I think the teacher candidates have different, you know, and they are predominantly white in our program, but, and they have some amazing ideas on how they could create curriculum as well. And so they tap into like current events and current issues, for example, and focus their time and attention in discussing those kinds of issues, as opposed to, you know, I think it's just making it, having a broad understanding of different topics and ideas.
Well, I'd love to bring us to a close by asking these amazing women, what specifically, if you have something, just what do you turn to right now as your inspiration? And is there something you could quickly share with us that helps you give your resolve right now?
I already have my mic unmuted, so I guess I'll go. I've been turning to a variety of things, but one of the things that has always been my source of strength, and I think this will also answer Maggie's question and a little bit with Chris, because I'm not an educator, so I don't really have a point of entry per se response, but knowing our history has been phenomenally empowering for me. And I was very fortunate to go to Native American preparatory school before it was closed down. And that was my first and only extensive introduction into Native American history, framed in a way where it wasn't a relic of the past, but something that is living and that informs our current situation. And I think that as we move forward and as I continue to grapple with a lot of these issues and the intersection of and convergence of all of these issues that we've covered throughout our whole panel, that's been something I've been leaning back on, is just going back to the history of corporate capitalism, going back to the history of American democracy, and really breaking apart a lot of these things to understand the current social political context that we're operating in, and the tools that they use to convince the masses that this system, these structures are inevitable, that these systems and these structures are the best ways. Because understanding that, I think, has what's been really helping me better inform me on how to use the knowledge and the wisdom that I'm gaining from my elders to combat that, to combat those narratives, to reclaim our voices, to reclaim our histories, and reclaim our solutions in a holistic and authentic way. And I think that that's something that's vastly missing from the political education of most Americans, let alone Native Americans in particular. And it serves a double purpose when it's erased from the curriculum and from the educational experiences of our reservation Indigenous youth. And so I think that when we can name those things and the intentions behind those things and why we have the education system that we have today, and we can understand that, then we can better respond and build solutions to address those issues.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, an inspirational quote is that fire lives in our heart, and that comes from our the coordinator, the ITEP coordinator. She's Diné as well. Her name is Enrique Quesalt. And this quote actually came from her parents that she relayed to us in terms of the teachings that the emergence of fire and the origin of fire, it exists in our hearts. And so when I think about that, I think about the teachers that I'm engaging with. I'm preparing to be teachers. I think about my daughter and the fire in her heart to learn the language and to find ways to pose questions in her classroom that would just disrupt an idea. I think she has a really strong connection to the cornfield that we have right now. And that energy that she has is really about how we're also teaching her about the knowledge of being at the field, what the corn represents, their children, and how do we take care of them. But also in preparation for one of her ceremonies that will be coming up in about 3 or 4 years or so, getting her ready for that. And I think all of that collectively is what inspires me to continue doing the work and sustaining, our cultures and our knowledge through the teachers and the youth.
And I know we're over time, so I'll just say super quickly, in addition to the things that Janene and Val have mentioned, knowing our history, knowing our struggles deeply and intimately, I've really challenged myself to kind of learn more about struggles in other communities, whether it's the Mi'kmaq fishermen or the land back movement in Canada, but also in this particular moment of like severe, anti-Black racism. Also, the struggles within and among our relatives in the Black community and Black Indigenous communities, and reading and trying to learn more about those histories, the women from Combahee and their women warriors and organizers, historically and currently, the Black queer and trans communities. I mean, it's just, there's so much out there. It can be its own kind of overwhelmingness, but it's also been really inspiring to me to kind of learn new things and reground my knowledge and our connections to other communities in struggle.
Sandy, Janene, Valerie, thank you all for hosting this tonight and being with us. I know I speak for everybody that's been in the audience that when we give us our sincere thanks and our gratitude for all the knowledge that you've shared and your experiences. I want to thank the viewers for tuning in today, and I hope to see you again in the new year after in the new year, because we will be hosting more Indigenous Methodologies programs in the future, and I'm really happy to announce that today for the first time publicly. So please check out our website, abbemuseum.org, and all of our social medias so that you can stay in tune. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Star. Abbe Museum people. Janene, Val.